Hello and welcome to episode 23 of Subplot of Course, a podcast discussing new science fiction work on the second Tuesday of every month. I'm Stavros, and with me is someone who definitely tells their students they're idiots if they disagree with the government strategies, Charlie. Say hi, Charlie.
I mean, are they not?
Yeah, that's a good point.
I'm gonna get fired. Da, 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 da.
Charlie teaches math. Also with me is Vincent, who is studying how suicidal people would need to be in order to pack them into large underground cities. Say hi, Vincent.
I mean, people live underground all the time. There's nothing suicidal about that. It's whether or not you put the suicidal people down underground in the first place. I think they were perfectly rational when they went down there.
Yeah, another good point. And Vincent's an epidemiologist. And finally, we're also joined for the second time by guest host Adrian, who once again is much more competent than any of us in any kind of literature analysis.
Not that it matters, because in this, unity government society, there's no humanities at all. So yeah.
That is true.
Yay.
You do not have a place in the Wandering Earth.
Yep.
All math, all day. It's the best.
Yep. And yes, in case it's not obvious, we're talking today about the novella, The Wandering Earth, written by Liu Cixin and published in 2000. So, of course, you should be prepared for spoilers. So the synopsis of this book, set sometime in the near future. This short story brings us to a world where Earth's sun has been discovered to be turning into a red giant significantly ahead of schedule. Earth's governments, united under one coalition, have come up with a ludicrous plan. You can see where I'm going with this and what we're going to do later.
Ludicrous speed!
I only assume that Earth approaches ludicrous speed at some point. But anyway, so
No. It says exactly how fast it goes in the book. Anyway, just go.
Yes, anyway, there's a plan, at least, to transplant the whole planet wholesale into a nearby compatible star system, a plan that would take many generations to accomplish. The main character conveniently learns about the background of the plan in school, mostly involved in the construction of thousands of Earth engines at points on the globe that will stop the rotation of the Earth, then slingshot the Earth out of orbit, through the asteroid belt, past Jupiter, and then out towards the compatible star system. We also learned about the Earth takers and the Earth leavers, and how the leaver strategies were not feasible, and that the government is firmly taker. The main character's family lives in an underground city during most of this, and they must endure a variety of dangers, including volcanic activity, travel through the solar system's asteroid field, and eventually, and most dramatically, an armed populist rebellion against the coalition when amateur astronomers decide that the sun won't explode after all. And spoiler, the government is always right, and it happens.
Sun explodes.
Yes. And the story ends with the aging protagonist remarking that the planet has gone beyond Pluto and that he thinks about the future in a very starry-eyed manner. So a very exciting novel here.
You know what's the most exciting part, Stavros?
Tell me.
Is this the first time you've had to actually sit down and read a physical book?
Yes. And, so for those of you who don't know, I may... I have a long commute, so I'll listen to a novel, in the car. And
not a novel, all novels.
All novels, yes.
All novels.
But this author, he's popular in China, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But there is no audiobook of his short story collection.
I'm sure there is. You just have to learn Chinese first. It'd be totally worth it, Stavros.
Yeah.
It'd save you a lot of time.
Get
the audio Chinese guide to learning Chinese, and then you listen to the audio recording of the Chinese book. That
sounds super feasible.
You have a long commute. You could totally do it.
I just feel like Stavros deserves a nice little golf clap for that. So everybody.
Oh, thank you.
He's literate. He doesn't rely on a man in a box to tell him what he's reading.
Yeah. I guess
Didn't the mayor of South Bend, who's running for president, right? There was this anecdote about how he learned Swedish just so he could read more books in Swedish.
I should do that. I should learn Chinese.
Must have been the girl with the dragon tattoo or something like that. Weren't all the books Swedish?
I believe so. Yeah,
I think so. They're
Swedish War is a big deal.
Big fan.
But anyway, so speaking of, so the reason why one of the reasons why we're reading this short story, is because there's a recent novel or a movieization of this novella in China, which is making tons of money. I think it's one of the most popular movies in China. And I kind of looked for it here just to see if there was a way that I could watch it and just check it out. But of course I couldn't find it. But just doing some internet searching, there are a number of differences between the what happens in the film and the novella. I think there's a lot more focus on, restarting the Earth, Earth engines and getting, putting mountain pieces in there so they can fire correctly and stuff like that. So
The most hilarious thing about the movie is that it made $700 million worldwide, and only 8 million of that came from outside of China. So why do you call it worldwide when it really just made all its money in China?
it's still a lot of money.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Still
Of money.
pretty popular.
The movies are different from the books?
Slow down. That never happens.
I mean, I watched Dune, and then I had a perfectly reasonable conversation with you guys.
It's true.
No, it's not. Don't believe my lies.
But I think, Vincent, you did a little bit of looking into Cixin's life. So why don't you give us the rundown? What's this guy like?
Yeah, Liu Laoshi is a really cool guy. I call him Liu Laoshi because it's kind of a Chinese way to say some guy's a professor. He's like really good at what he does. Because this guy's really fucking good at what he does. He's like 9 times in a row he's won the best sci-fi award in China, and he's like the only based in Asia Asian person to ever win a Hugo. And he won a Hugo for the Three Body Problem, which is one other book that he wrote, and it's one of a series. And the third of the trilogy actually won a Nebula Award or Locus Award as well. And so it's he's a pretty freaking solid sci-fi writer. Though the funny thing about him that parallels my life, that makes me a little bit like Liu Laoshi, is that his wife and daughter never listen to or never read anything he writes, and my wife and daughter never listen to any podcasts that I record. So yeah. I think I kind of feel that same creative roadblock in the family kind of lifestyle. But the guy is pretty awesome. He's 55 years old. As far as I can tell, he makes it through loads of censorship in China because anything that's related to political things gets censored really strongly, and he's still able to write very complex novels which are focused around governments and politics and things like that, and still wins awards in China and doesn't get censored for it. So all I can say is going from that to writing a Chinese novel which gets translated with that, which then wins a Western award for best sci-fi novel, means that he must have been a really goddamn good writer when he wrote that first book that year. So hats off to him.
Yeah. And Adrian, maybe you can give us some context since you're kind of the expert here. Does that, paint him in any kind of particular picture, judging from your experience?
I mean, it certainly is rare, right? I mean, he's a sort of singular figure in the speculative fiction community. I think that since we're sort of transitioning to the novel here, or the novella here, it makes sense to think about the reason why a novel like this might both be allowed through censorship, right, and also heavily promoted, right, throughout China. Because, again, this is the only work of his I've read. I've been meaning to read The Three Body Problem for a while. But as you said earlier on, right, it's one that paints centralized government in a very, very, very positive light, right? And one that kind of reflects, that paints individuals in very negative light. So that just sort of came to mind as Vince, you were talking about his accomplishments.
Yeah, good point. Charlie, did you have something?
No, just that I'm going to give Vince's
contribute.
I'm going to give Vince's 2-year-old daughter a hard time about not following our podcast.
Yeah, I know.
Seems reasonable. But yeah, jumping off about the portrayal of government. So that is actually the next thing I was going to talk about. Think about how this novella portrays the Leavers. So there are these anti-government, radicals. And I think there at one point the main character is in class and one of the kids my dad's a Leaver and we could build so many spaceships, and the teacher has zero problem
spaceships
publicly embarrassing this kid about and even the main character's idiot.
Yeah, I mean, if you're wrong, why not get embarrassed publicly? It's learning. I'm just kidding. Yeah. There's no such thing as a stupid question, unless you're a Leaver.
Unless you're a Leaver, apparently.
That's what I tell my students.
Do you ever publicly embarrass your students, Charlie, for the sake?
Yeah, they're like, maybe we should take a spaceship, and I'm like, you're dumb. You're not paying attention.
Taking a mountain would be much better scientifically.
We're just taking everything.
I mean, why not?
I mean, have you ever seen people pack on a trip? Why take one suitcase when you can take 5? I mean, you never know.
Makes a lot of sense.
Forgot your 5th tube of toothpaste at home.
Yeah. But does this work into the, this guy is, allowed to publish books and is really popular in China? Did he write it like this, do you think, in order to appease censors, or Is there some other more natural course of why he did
I don't
this?
think so. I mean, he could have easily portrayed it as the government says taking spaceships is the best way out. And I mean, according to your theory that he's like, pandering to the government and making sure that he doesn't get censored, like he could just say the government came up with the best idea and then just followed it however he liked. So I don't think he wrote taking the Earth as a government appeasing thing. I think he just wrote it because it's a freaking goddamn interesting way to transport all of Earth's civilization somewhere. Because I've read a lot of sci-fi, I've read a lot of spaceship sci-fi, I've watched a lot of spaceship sci-fi, Star Trek, Star Wars, all of the various space novellas there ever were. You only make a Death Star, but you never transport Tatooine or like any planet from one stellar system to another. Like that's a pretty goddamn creative idea. And then to do the hard science on it and make sure that it kind of makes sense. I'll defer to Charlie on that, but I think he actually got his numbers relatively correct.
Interesting.
The only analog I can think of, like in history, is the Japanese light fiction novel and anime Legends of the Galactic Heroes, where there's like this massive interstellar empire which is heavily influenced by the Germans, which is great, and the people who love democracy, right? They flee from this empire by building ships of ice on the planet they're enslaved on, essentially. And these ships are hyper efficient, right? Because they're able to deal with all the asteroid stuff. That they're able to go and find a new planet to live on the other side of the galaxy through like narrow corridor, and there start a democratic civilization. But beyond that, yeah, I mean, like most of our, most of our sort of science fiction, for various reasons, right, is very focused on the spaceship model of colonization and spray down to the universe, right? And we can talk about why that might be later on. But yeah, this is a really innovative idea, absolutely.
I mean, if you're going to race like spacecraft in space and be like, I can do the Kessel run in 15 parsecs, you're not like, well, I'm running an Earth model planetoid. You got Jupiter model planetoid? You're slow as shit. I'm going to run circles around you.
Yeah. I mean, there is. I mean, that's definitely the hook of this novella is like, holy crap, they're friggin' flying the Earth through space. But just back to the I'm not totally sold. This isn't like a insurance against censorship. Just the way that the rebels are portrayed, and the quality of the science employed by the rebels, and who are essentially think that the takers were right, or I'm sorry, the leavers were right. It's just the way.
Oh, you agree with the Stavros already, holding that against you.
It might be sort of more just safe to say like it's a sort of happy coincidence, right? That a work like this does ultimately sort of put the government in a superior position to the people, whereas a lot of science fiction tends to go the other way, right? I mean, you either have perfect governments or terrible governments in science fiction, right?
Mostly terrible.
Yeah, mostly terrible, right? Or like degrading governments, right? And that's usually the catalyst for leaving. And it's interesting to see here, right? This is one of those few that really kind of like puts the penalty essentially on the people for screwing this up.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, it's very rare that you have hyper competent scientists working for the government. Usually it's like, oh, the rogue hacker like knows what's best, or the rogue scientist like knows that the Earth is going to get destroyed and the government's covering it up. It's like in this book, it's like, no, the government scientists their math is like crazy good. Like the Earth does escape the solar system. We also don't get melted down. And also the things that they predicted about the sun melting, like, yeah, you just killed us all. And then 5 seconds later, what we predicted to happen actually did happen. The Earth and the sun does melt down, and now don't you feel bad because you kill all the smartest people on the planet, and now you have to fly the rest of the way to Alpha Centauri.
So my one thing about that is like, wasn't everyone just in school and had been trained for like the past 4 generations specifically to believe all this stuff, and then like they show up and they're just like, yeah, you guys are gonna be sad if you kill us all, instead of being like, yo, we did math and it works, and you should understand math because we educated you.
It's possible they read different versions of this. Did your guys have something about like genetic memory in it? Your version? Did you talk about that at all?
No.
In
government censorship, Adrian. Where'd you get yours?
I got the ebook. Basically, like when one of these kids is like trying to sort of understand the Earth engines, so they briefly mentioned that like it's a good thing we perfected genetic memory so that his like father's engineering skills could be instilled into him, and he would be able to understand like the complex mathematics of this machine.
Oh yeah, I remember that.
It must be a different translation because there's a phrase similar to there's something similar-ish to that I remember, but it's like I'd have to flip through and reread stuff to get exactly what it was. I don't remember seeing the term like genetic memory, but there's something kind of where it's like people have been, like raised specifically to be like more efficient and like raised or bred.
Yeah, you don't.
What it is exactly.
It's called you don't waste your time on arts and sciences or arts and crafts, and you do all your time doing.
It's true. But just to switch gears a little bit, when by the time the main character is born in this novel or in this novella, the Earth, the Wandering Earth project or whatever they call it is already definitely underway and things like that. And if you guys recall, a lot of the initial themes are like everyone on Earth's like working together and there's like a world government and everyone's just like focused on survival. So I'm reading this, right? And I'm like, all right, like if this really happened, there would be all kinds of, rioting. I'm not even sure that it's even feasible.
If you don't like this, then you don't like Star Trek, because Star Trek's got the same goddamn.
So that's the thing.
So we all unify as humanity, and there's no money. It's like
don't get me started on Star Trek, but anyway, so but I mean, in Star Trek, there is a catalyst of A, nuclear war, and B, meeting aliens for the first time. This is just like humanity has to face crises, and as we all know in the real world, just because we all face a crisis together doesn't mean people are reasonable about that. But so I'm reading this and I'm like, all right, this seems like pretty infeasible. Like what's going to happen? And then the rebellion starts and I was like, there it is. It's something like that had to.
How'd you feel? How'd you feel after the rebellion?
I felt exonerated. I was like, this should have happened like 100 years ago.
We should have killed all the smart people and then like realized that we were going to burn in the fire.
I think that's why at the end I was like, really? Like you managed to make jets that perfectly launched the entire Earth into an orbit through which Jupiter would eject it from the solar system. Like everyone worked together that far, but then like 6 people were just like, I don't know if the sun's really gonna explode, and then they like murdered the government.
Yeah,
it's like maybe you guys should have thought of that like 50 years ago or something. Or how many hundreds of years this went on for?
Yeah, I was just reading that, and while the rebellion's going on, I'm like, man, I'm not sure if this book wasn't written in China, if it would just be true that the amateur astronomers were right, and then sure enough, it's like, oh man, the government was totally right.
Well, they're called amateur for a reason.
Well, I also do like how it's like dramatic irony. It's like the moment they killed all the scientists, they're like, we did it. We're going to fix everything. And then the sun explodes and they're like, Mom, I guess we're...
It's true. But yeah, I mean, how'd you get, were you guys like reading this, all about the human cooperation and things like that? You're like, yeah, this is, that's totally believable.
I felt that it was a novella, so he didn't have enough time to really cover all the details of like what was going on.
Of course, yeah.
And so like you kind of have to get to the point. It's kind of like Star Trek. Like you could make an entire season or like 20 seasons about how you get humanity to like line up with the idea that hey, they're Klingons and we should not fight each other. We should go and establish peace and like how do we do all this stuff. But at some point you kind of got to get on with the story. And so the story is like there might have been like 5 generations of people infighting, and whoever made it to president probably killed a fuck ton of people. But in the end, somehow they got to the point where we're all going to die. We only have this generation. We got to get out. And so let's just make sure that everyone is on the same page. Well, and they weren't. You still have levers and takers. You have levers and takers. So he still has that conflict going on. But everyone at least was at least not going to kill each other.
But as all the students know, the levers are stupid and deserve to be shunned. You don't feel like it's just the literary thing. It's like, what if the Earth was a spaceship?
I mean, absolutely, right? Like this is definitely like a conceit that is turned into a novella, right? Like an idea, and that's very common in speculative fiction, right? But even that, like, why this particular idea, right? If you think about like the Foundation series, right? Like that is an idea which is germinating from a moment of heightened concern about superpowers, right? Hence, we have this long arc of the fall of Rome that Asimov sort of spins out, right? That you can sort of trace these conceptual lineages throughout a lot of the major works of science fiction. So this one really kind of boggles my mind a little bit because it seems so out of left field, and I'm just sort of trying to think, like what is the mindset that makes this an available option?
I think it's left field, but I think it's also rooted like more heavily in science growing up. A lot of the stories you read growing up are rooted in sci-fi technology that don't exist in the current world.
Mhm.
Like, not to say that like Cixin's novel doesn't have technology that doesn't exist in the current world. You throw mountains into a furnace and then it flies the earth. Like, that's technology that we don't have. But I mean, a lot of the other technologies that we have are like, hey, we have a Gundam. We make a little robot and it has infinite fuel and it flies from star to star. Or like Star Trek, it's like, oh, all we do is just hop in a little plane and it's got light speed travel and we just go. It's like, I mean, and to a certain extent, it does fulfill some of the like the realities of current technology, which is like we don't actually have a good fuel source that could actually fly us from one area to another in space in a reasonable time frame. You can talk about solar sails and a bunch of other technology all you want, but like burning the earth up as fuel, it's like, oh, I guess if you're talking about like energy conservation, it's like, yeah, it takes energy to get from one place to another, and if you don't have enough energy, then just set the world on fire because the world's really big, as opposed to take this magical spaceship which has like a gas tank the size of a Prius, and it's like, let's see if we can get there.
So then the stuff in the past is sort of technological optimism, and this book is sort of informed by technological pessimism, right?
A little bit more, yeah.
Limitations. Oh, cool.
That's what I feel like.
Yeah, I don't know about the science because I'm not as versed as perhaps you guys would be in something like that. But I mean, this is
world, Stavros.
This is obviously, I feel like this novel is very much like, what if planets had engines on them? And then that's the premise. I think it's just novelty. I'm not sure if there's any kind of
what a pun, Stavros. Novelty.
Unintended pun. But yeah, I'm not sure there's any kind of higher reasoning behind that, or it's just like, we've had books of spaceships. Why not make the planet the spaceship? Back in Charlie, come on.
The guy did win a freaking award. Like, I think a little thought went into it.
Sorry, I was thinking about the fact that it's not a novelty; it's a novellity at this point.
Okay.
Oh.
Good night. I'm here all night.
I think I agree with Vince ultimately, which is that there's something pessimistic about this novella, right? Like, as much as it's about like the power of human fortitude, like this sense that there is nowhere else for us to go, right? There's a deep kind of claustrophobia to this novella, which feels kind of funny given, as you guys talking about, like the weird like advanced technology that they're able to produce, right? And I guess the echo in the back of my mind was thinking about, like, when War Planets and this novel were written, right? This is before 9/11 happened. This is after the Cold War ends, and we're in this period where, like, we feel, America certainly feels like, the world is theirs, is ours entirely, and there's this deep confusion and pessimism about that amount of power and that lack of direction, right? Certain scholars termed it like the end of history, the moment when like the great major ideological conflicts of the 20th century ended and there was nothing to follow up. There was just going to be the continuation of what was before over and over again. And it just made me sort of think about, like, maybe that's sort of where we are today to a certain extent, right? Like, back then was the big kind of dot-com bubble sort of bursting. Here we have sort of a similar kind of overheating economic engine that's sort of, or messing certain kind of technology that may be bursting, a certain pessimism about technology in general, right? A heightened awareness of environmental issues, right? Things like that.
Yeah, I think that's certainly a valid thematical observation. Although I'm still going with Earth with fucking engine strapped to it. Is pretty
sure,
awesome.
That's got to be where it started.
Now, is it V6 or is it V8 stuff? Like,
I know. How many cylinders are in each?
How many horsepower would it take to pull Earth?
How much horsepower?
Well, before we get into our roleplay exercise, Charlie, do you have any comments on the physics and believability, like any of the tech stuff?
Heavy element fusion. I want to explain now.
I mean, clearly the type of whatever they are using to convert like mountains into rockets is definitely just like sci-fi conceit, where it's like, just throw it in there and get the rockets going.
Does it have anything to do with like how you take like molten whatever and you put it through a bowling ball and just like it fuels itself forever and like melts itself to the center of the Earth?
It's like I feel like just like momentum calculations, it would require an awful lot of the Earth to use the Earth as a spaceship just from its own mass.
Yeah,
I mean,
I think they mention it too, right? It would take X% of all the mountains and something like that.
Yeah, but I mean, the amount, like, so just to give you an idea, because I've heard this quote from Neil deGrasse Tyson. Like, if you took the most perfect sphere mankind has ever made, like the imperfections in it would make Mount Everest look like a peanut, like super tiny. So like the Earth is almost perfectly spherical. Like the mountains, the crust, all of that is like nothing compared to the mass of just like the rest of it.
Sure.
Like I feel like you would have to eat up a good chunk of the Earth. Like these people living underground would not be underground by the time they burn through these engines, as far as like I could figure out.
They went to the mines of Moria.
Miles
It's okay.
What was that, Adrian?
No, a total mile underground felt pretty shallow, honestly, when they were talking about
Yeah.
how far down they were.
Might need a little bit more depth there.
They just still find the Balrog, move in.
Because
It's okay.
there's no magical engines on these things. It's just melt down parts of the planet, launch them into space, and the Earth will move the other direction. That just feels like that would require a lot of the Earth to be launched into space, more so than would really be practical for taking the Earth into space. Like, you just lose all the benefits because you just have like this sad, tiny, now mostly molten planet that you're launching out there or something.
Charlie, what happens if you go into space? Like, would you still retain an atmosphere if Earth just started flying out in the middle of space, and not rotating and stuff like that? Like, what would happen?
There's no, I mean, if you're accelerating it very slowly, it's not like there's friction because space is mostly nothing. So it's just you'd probably lose like a little bit of it, I guess, just due to the acceleration. But I'm guessing if they're accelerating slowly enough that amount really doesn't matter. I wonder if the acceleration due to being slingshot from Jupiter would actually dislodge a good proportion of the atmosphere. But again, I had
and they stop the rotation of the Earth too. Like, is there anything about that scientific? Like, you have to stop the Earth rotation?
At that point, I'm pretty sure you would absolutely like wreck the weather systems of the Earth. Like,
Right.
Like even more. Like in the book, describes some pretty dramatic events caused by the Earth engines and flying through certain things and all that, and like the temperature changes from going further and further and closer to the sun and whatnot. But just the stopping the rotation of the Earth seems like you'd wreck most of surface humanity from that. Again, that's not a physics thing. That's just me guessing from what little I know about climatology and how it relates to the Earth rotating and whatnot.
And the weird thing is that they have like thrusters all over the Earth, so I wasn't quite sure why they had to stop the Earth. I thought it was like maybe because all the thrusters had to point out the back of Earth so we can fly forward. But it was like Earth is round, and I never got the idea that the thrusters were like all pointing in the same direction.
I think the idea is there's not continents everywhere, so it's not like a uniform sphere that you could put all the thrusters on. So like they're talking about, it's like you pretty much had to use
North America and Asia.
Which is weird because they're both in the northern hemisphere. That seems like that would lead to some weird unequilibrium type stuff in terms of it spinning. Also, the worst class I ever took was about angular momentum of spinning objects and doing it irregularly, and I have no interest in ever doing that again.
Oh, so you took a class. Can you spend the rest of the podcast calculating when nothing's feasible?
No, that class was called Death Mechanics for a reason. It was the Weeder course, the Weeder class for the physics major. It was designed to make people who weren't serious about it quit.
And here we are.
I did not quit.
Charlie ain't no quitter.
That's right.
Hey, Mama didn't make no quitter.
Yeah, like I got like a 60% on the final. I was like, oh no! And then they're like, you get an A-. I was like, well, okay, yay.
Great work, Charlie. That's why we have you here.
Yeah, so everything I say, you can trust me 60% of the time, maybe.
That's why he's called Budget John, because John he can trust 100% of the time.
Hey!
Wow. Well, with that, let's go to our roleplay scenario. So what we're going to do is a little bit of a debate. So in high school, I think most of us, with the exception of perhaps Charlie, was on a speech and/or debate team of some kind. So we're going to
debates for losers.
That's right. We'll see how that turns out for you. But we're going to do a little bit of a debate for team leavers versus the team takers. So we're going to have a pretty simplistic debate format here where the leavers will make their argument, then the takers will make their argument. And
to be clear, the leavers are saying we should take spaceships, fly away.
Yes.
And takers are in favor of taking the Earth with them and leaving. The Earth is a spaceship as opposed to little spaceships being the spaceship.
Exactly. But who knows? Maybe the leavers could make giant spaceships.
Yeah, you could make I don't know how you get enough mass to make a spaceship bigger than the Earth.
Wait,
but hey,
wait! Don't spoil the arguments.
Okay.
All right, so Team Levers is going to go first, and in the predetermined roles, Team Levers, myself and Adrian, we're gonna make the argument for why you should not take the planet and instead take spaceships, and Charlie and Vincent will be on Team Takers. So I'm going to go first. It's been a few decades since I've done debate, but I will do my best.
I want visual aids.
I know.
Oh man.
I need citations. I need dates on citations. I need pieces of evidence to corroborate what
This is more Lincoln Douglas style, where you just you make the logical argument.
You make whatever you want.
That's right.
Come on.
You just say whatever you want. Anyway, here goes. Are you tired of doing what the man says and taking whole planets with you when it's obviously a bad idea? Well, you should fight the power, be a cool person, and join Team Levers. Honestly, spaceships, way more feasible. Why would you want to shuttle around the galaxy X million tons or billion tons? I haven't even looked up how much the Earth weighs because it's so goddamn impractical to take a whole planet with you, as opposed to just strapping an engine on a spaceship and just taking that to the next system, which you can then just settle. All right, the energy requirements of moving the mass of the Earth is just too much. And you guys heard the rest of the podcast. The amount of Earth you would just have to put in a truck and dump into a whatever magic spaceship, planet spaceship engine is just too darn much. You've also got to expect that the government governing the populations on spaceships is just more practical than governing the entire population of the planet. You can even see in the book that there is an armed rebellion that took over the entire planet. Nothing you could do just because of some amateur damn astronomers. Whereas if you did the equivalent on ships, it'd be much easier to control and maintain the population. And lastly, my last point here, you guys read what happened when the Earth passed through the asteroid field. In spaceships, I assume you could easily just drive around some damn asteroids. You can't just be like, well, some of the planet's gonna get destroyed by asteroids. Nope, just freaking fly around them. It's that easy. So in conclusion, Team Levers is the best. Team Takers is the worst.
Oh my God, Stavros, you are so wrong. You are so wrong. Yes. So we are going to quote drive around space with quote space engines. So what, you just putting your tires to the rubber of the empty vastness of space? You know that's not how it works, right? There's something called conservation of momentum. Oh, and you're gonna run your spaceship on what? On what, Stavros? What are you gonna burn fuel for? What type? You gotta bring your fuel with you. Why not bring all the fuel with you? Just bring the whole damn planet. Yeah, you're going to have to carry around the rest of the planet with you the whole time, but you're going to do the same thing with any spaceship you make. And, who gets to go on your special spaceship anyways? Like, clearly you don't intend on taking everybody. What is it? Is it going to be Stavros' special fun-time spaceship with him and Adrian going off into space, leaving everyone else behind? No, we're not going to leave people behind. We're going to take everybody and everything, because we need everything we can take. Like, once the sun is, where most of the energy for life and everything comes from? The sun. We're not going to have in space, especially once it explodes. The sun. So, what are you going to run your spaceship on anyway? Everyone's going to starve. All the power's going to run out. You just got to freeze in the vastness of space in your stupid spaceship? Huh? What about, have you even managed to make a self-sustained ecosystem in a lab? Have you put that fish in a bag with whatever he needs and he survives? No, clearly not, as the teacher tells the stupid kid who's a stupid lever in the stupid book. No, it doesn't work. At least the Earth has a geothermal core that is still working and provides energy. Like, it might melt a couple cities along the way. Some people. But it's better than everyone dying and most people getting vaporized in the explosion of the sun.
That was a lot better than I expected from him.
Wow, well done.
I didn't hear anything about the fish. I'm very disappointed.
He did say fish in a bag. He didn't get to his main point.
All right, so we finished the arguments, so now we move on to the rebuttals. So Adrian, destroy this fool.
All right, so the first thing is, right, you need fuel in order to maneuver something. But as Stavros said, right, the amount of fuel you would need to move something as big as the Earth, right, is going to be proportional when you're trying to move tiny little spaceships. So the amount of fuel that any ship would have to carry is probably going to be a lot less, certainly, and logistically more feasible than the notion of carrying an entire planet, right, worth of fuel with you. Right. And your issue about, about power generation, right? It's true that the sun generates most of the power, but it's also true that in this wandering Earth scenario, the planet moving, the Earth no longer has the sun as a power source anyway, right? It's pretty clear that they have some kind of stable power source such that they're able to both live underground, right, grow food underground and propagate underground, and while maintaining apparently a space fleet on the surface of the planet, right? They clearly have at least enough technology to make spaceships which are capable of maneuvering through asteroid fields, as the asteroid field episode suggests, right? And it just feels like it would have been a much better investment to put their technology towards that kind of a solution, right? Rather than this massive, giant project that is going to clearly require, as Sarah said, right, a lot of social controls in order to sort of maintain it, right? Not to mention the kind of just like the crazy logistics of housing millions and millions of people in singular like little cities where they're going to be compacted, right? So yeah, I mean, it may be true that, as they say, like the size of the thing being moved in space matters, but the amount of room that these humans have is already sort of pretty small. And so I just don't quite see the reason why technology that they have couldn't be applied better to much more maneuverable spaceships, right? Where at the very least, right, you're sort of spreading out the amount of risk that's involved in traversing the space for such long distances and for such a long amount of time.
Okay, solid argument. Let's get it back to Taker's rebuttal with Vincent.
All right, so last speech of the day. So let's keep this not ad hoc arguments against each other and each other's beliefs. But when you think about just the evidence that we have on hand, if you read the novel, what it all boils down to at the end of the day is what is actually possible. What is actually going to get you to your final destination, Alpha Centauri, alive? And you have the two options. You take a spaceship, and you also take the Earth. The book does a really good job of, one, actually, if you just read the book, you can find that all the science that has been involved in trying to take the planet Earth out of the solar system has apparently been spot on. There's like no deviations. It's 100% correct, which is, you could argue, very miraculous and very kind of like Deus Ex Machina, like miraculous, but it does work. And so in the world that Cixin writes, the government is actually not an incompetent government. It's actually a very, very competent government with very, very competent scientists. And when you look at all the taker or all the leavers populations who were saying we should take spaceships and we should leave, they were kind of, I assume, part of the group that said, hey, the science was bogus. The sun was not going to melt down. They killed the entire government, and then immediately afterwards, the sun melted down. So when you think about like it from just a logical scientific point of view, it's hard to argue against the world that Cixin has created, which is that the scientists that calculated the sun was going to melt down, that the Earth could leave the entire solar system, all of that actually science is actually spot on and true. Whereas the science that he portrays for why you should not leave, you should never leave the planet, also seemed to be relatively believable, in that it was hard for them to create an ecosystem which actually survive for more than a generation or two, based off of models and also basic experiments. Like basically saying that if you take a small spaceship out, you can't create an ecosystem where you recycle your air and you recycle your waste and have enough food and fuel to survive more than 1 or 2 generations. When you are presented with all the evidence, it kind of makes sense that at the very least, if you are a leaver, why would you not at least propose a hybrid plan where you take the entire planet as far as it can go, make your spaceships in the meantime? If the planet is not a good idea, and at any point you think it's a terrible idea, you can jump at that spaceship and do the best you can and live for a generation or two out in space and see if you can make it. In the end, it still feels that you have to have an element of taking with you because, one, the book makes it very possible. You leave Pluto, the planet's still intact. The majority of the population is alive compared to the spaceship point, which Charlie brings up, which is if you take a bunch of small spaceships, you just can't bring everyone at once. I think the major argument that Stavros and Adrian make, which is a really interesting one, is whether or not you can actually manage an entire population on Earth. And Stavros makes the point that a government on a spaceship would be easier than government on Earth because you can't control that many people. I actually argue that it's a ratio. question, because there was still a mutiny on the Bounty, and that little boat was way smaller than any spaceship that you might take. It's all a ratio of how much control do you have, how much police do you have, how much like absolute like authority does government have, and how unified your quote unquote rebellious elements might have, and not the question of how many people there are. Because if everyone on the planet is like scientifically minded and they're all about believing, then you're not going to have they did have a rebellion, but it's a question of like how big your army is. Is the rebel army bigger than yours? Because if your army is like 90% of the population, you're never going to lose a war. So in the end, I kind of feel like at the very least, you would have to argue that taking is essential just based on the evidence that the book provides, and that leaving is an option for the future. But you can't necessarily put your eggs in that basket just because science says no. That's all I got to say.
Nice. I like how the arguments went from like nonsensical, half-cocked to like actual rational discourse.
Starbucks, you did start out kind of rabble rousing. Sham wow, watch it absorb all the water. I was like, wow, stop! I didn't expect that.
It's a little attention grabby. That was,
yeah. You
forgot to say second law of thermodynamics. How are you gonna keep it going for that long?
Oh no, that's not allowed, Charlie. You can't rebut.
All right, do we have a clear winner here? Adrian, do you have a clear preference here? Who has the better argument?
I'm guessing we're going to end up 2-2 here.
Yeah.
But that's
What's your opinion?
I'm still on team Lever, I would say.
Okay, how about you, Charlie?
I mean, I think just given like real technology, I'm on team hang out and get vaporized.
Wow. All right, how about you, Vincent?
I think it depends strongly on the available science. So if you were talking about it from like a current Earth perspective, I'm not sure we actually have the technology to create a spaceship that could leave. At the same time, we'll not argue that we have the technology to make a planet move and escape like the entire solar system. But if you were in Cixin's world, I would say that you take, because at the end of the novel, Earth makes it out and everyone is still alive. So it's like, well, why would you not take it when you can still build spaceships like a hybrid
propaganda?
Argument? You got to take.
It's propaganda, man. Don't listen to the man.
Well, it is sci-fi, so
I still honestly I understand a lot of the arguments for the Earth fraction, but the one that always like makes me stop a little bit, and there is a kind of iron argument against this the Lever faction, which is that there are no planets that are habitable within a certain range, right? That they state very clearly, like, there's no place for these spaceships to go. Fair enough, but like the notion that like the biosphere of Earth would survive somehow, this complex biosphere that we're all dependent on would somehow survive this traversal, just also seems kind of crazy to me.
I think the idea is you would keep enough life going underground so that, the surface of the Earth would be utterly devastated, but you would have the resources to repopulate it versus like having to take whatever little you could on a spaceship.
I guess the other argument you can make is that like you're rolling the dice 100 times with 100 spaceships, or would you rather roll the dice 1,000 times buried underneath the planet? You might lose 99% of the cities, but if you're bound to fail that many times, the more times you try, the more chances you have of winning the lottery.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I feel like we could talk about this forever, and we are going way long with this episode. So let's jump straight to the our concluding segment, which is the things you liked, things you didn't like about this novella. I will go first. I do the thing I like the best is just conceptually the I kind of make fun of it during the show, but strapping engines to a giant planet and just making it bounce out of solar system, really cool idea. I really like that. It kind of, and it makes for a really good cover of the physical book, which I had to buy and read with my own eyeballs.
That's a con, the physical media.
The worst thing, as I hinted at, I feel it's just thinly veiled anti propaganda what do you call it, insurance against censorship. There's a lot of the government's right, if you don't believe the government you're stupid, and even the rebellions that picked up and almost killed everyone were wrong, and I just, it couldn't. I felt like it was just like blaring, "This book is from China" the entire time I was reading it, and not. I guess not to say that everything out of China is bad, but like just to say that that was what got it past the censors there. So let's go to Vincent. Why don't you go first this time?
Yeah, sure, happy to. Yeah. So rather than, I guess, what I liked and what I disliked, if I had to recommend to you whether or not to read this or not, and or watch the movie, I would say absolutely yes. This is a very, very novel novella. And novel in the sense that the ideas are very, very interesting. Granted, there are a lot of things that need to be fleshed out, but it is a very, very short read. So on top of that, if you're a guy that doesn't have that much time, you don't like holding books because they're too heavy, Stavros. Like this is a really easy read. You only have to hold it for like all of like, an evening and you're done with it. The book is really well written. It brings up a lot of very interesting ideas. We totally missed out on the whole like people knowing that they're about to die. So how do they treat their relationships with their peers, with their wives and husbands? Like it's a very kind of weird society that kind of it gets brought up, but very interesting to read. The fact that it's so different from every other sci-fi book that I've read makes it worth it. And that's where I kind of judge with sci-fi. Is like I can read the exact same space war story over and over and over again, but when someone brings something super interesting and different to me, I want to spend time to read different. And if that different idea is super cool and very well fleshed out and thought out, even more worth it. Cons, I think it was too short. I think the movie is super complicated, and I think there's a reason why it gets reviewed really, really well. I think Siskel and Ebert, I know one of them is dead, but they give him like 3.5 out of 4. A lot of people in China really liked it, apparently. Apparently people around the world did not, because they only watched $8 million worth of $700 million worth, but I can't find a theater around here that would play it.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure it was limited release internationally. That's the other reason.
Had to have been, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. If you are worried about the whole China about with Stavros, I would argue that a lot of sci-fi takes one polar extreme or the other. And I would say 99% of them take the polar extreme of the incompetent government that doesn't know what they're doing, the incompetent scientists who don't know what they're doing, and the superhero who is a average Joe who does everything right and saves the world. In some sense, that's really refreshing to read. But at the same time, we do have governments for a reason. Not that I trust our government 100%. I live in America. I probably trust the government the least out of like all the years I've been alive, like right now. But to a certain extent, people you do have to trust someone to lead you in some aspect. You may be at a job with a boss who is leading the company. You might hate your job, but there are some companies out there which are doing really good jobs and you have very good bosses. And at some point you can't always just say that leadership is always incompetent, and that if you say that leadership is competent, that you're like pandering to leadership. You're going to have both sides of the coin. Sometimes they're going to suck. Sometimes they're going to be great. This book is one where they're great. And it's kind of refreshing actually, because I'm not used to that. So all in all, I say go and read it.
Yeah.
Or watch it.
All right, Charlie. Best and worst.
All right. My thing's probably pretty simple. I think I really liked kind of the conceit and world building and that sort of thing. Yeah, I get that it's a little simplified given it's a novella, but it's like the first half of it is just explaining like, how did we get here? What did people discover? How was the government set up to solve this problem? And now like, how is the science working that we can do it and get through it and everything? And then it's talking about how, because we've been doing this for so many generations, it's kind of neat that people have this fear of the sun because all of civilization is built towards getting away from the sun, but we might not do it in time. So I thought it's like everything kind of comes together really well. And I think my one complaint, as I said before, is even though there's been generations and education of everybody, and yeah, there's people who disagree and whatnot, the idea of like the rebellion at the end of it, and especially like the sun exploding immediately afterwards, just felt like a little convenient. Like, hey, this story needs a little more drama or something like that. It felt more like a device to add some, like a little bit more of a story to what otherwise is kind of just like a cool setting that gets fleshed out, like an important event that isn't necessarily like people versus people. I could have done without that. But otherwise, I thought it was really good.
Okay, awesome. And Adrian.
Yeah, absolutely cool conceit, right? This short story does what, a lot of really good short science fiction short stories do, which is to sort of flesh out a concept or an idea, right? And this is a really innovative idea, and it is definitely pretty fully fleshed out, right? Obviously, a little bit more length would have been useful here in terms of giving the science a little more room to breathe, but it's a well-written novella, no question about it. Least, I think the novella has a really interesting sort of challenge, which is that it's all about collective action, right? You need like the whole of the earth to do the thing, the central action, the story, but it's also trying to tell the story from the perspective of a single person, right, and not a very important person, right? That's how most stories kind of get around this problem. Is they usually go to an individual who is at the center of the story and of the machinations that are happening in order to make the two kind of stories merge, right? Asimov does this all the time in the Foundation series, right, where it's always like whoever is part of the linchpin move the Foundation is about to go through. That's the focus character for each of his sort of short stories or chapters in that series. Yeah. And here we don't get that, right? And it therefore kind of makes the book feel like weirdly sociological, but not very social, right? Like it's kind of hard to feel for any of the characters in the book. It feels very kind of cold to a certain extent, and that may be an intended effect. I think that's actually very effective. It is. But it also makes the reading experience a little bit more challenging than because then at that point all you have to focus on is the major conceit, and that sometimes doesn't have the same kind of narrative power to really push one through the full length of the novella.
Yeah, good point. Well, good. Yeah, I'm glad we had a good mix of opinions. That led to some really good discussion. So I think we should end it right there. So thank you, Adrian, once again for guesting. We really appreciate you acting, much more competent than any of us would be when discussing things like this.
Debatable, but
can we keep him? Can we keep him?
We'll have to see. We'll have to talk after this. But listeners, of course, if you have feedback or suggestions on books we should read and discuss, you can reach us at subplotofcoursepodcast@gmail.com or on Twitter at subplotpodcast. And for May, we're going to be reading a much longer book, an actual novel, called A Fire Upon the Deep by Werner Vinge. Very exciting. Say goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye, everybody.
And longer's not always better. That's what she said.